all doing today? My name is Jordan McCracken-Foster, and I'm a teaching artist here at Art Prof. And I'm here today with Art Prof Clara Liu and fellow teaching artist Alex Rowe. And today we are going to be doing a user critique, and we're going to be looking at someone's work today. And if you guys want to turn your artistic weakness into your strength, you should go to artprof.org, where you can find lots of free tutorials and critiques and learn how to become a better artist. But before we get into the critique, Clara, we have a special announcement from you today.
We have a slight change of plans because we had a last-minute shift in the content for the stream. So what we're going to do, actually, we're going to critique this first piece, which is titled Blue Light by an anonymous artist. And we thought because we don't have a second piece to critique today, we would just spend the rest of the stream doing some Q&A. Because you know what? You guys were overflowing with questions yesterday, and we figured that would be a great way to fill the rest of the stream. So that way you guys can have just a little bit more of us. All right. This artwork we're looking at is a watercolor and acrylic painting. It's 11 inches by 7 inches. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the artist statement so you guys have a bit of a sense of what the piece is about. It's by a 15-year-old high school student, and they explain in their statement that they feel that their art has been lacking creativity and originality, getting stuck in the trap of just copying reality without adding anything of their own. So the artist says that the piece symbolizes their relationship with technology, feeling sucked into a screen, like they're in a different world where time doesn't flow the same way. They're at peace because they don't have to deal with real-world responsibilities. And by the way, this artist statement is in the video description below. So if you guys want to read the whole thing, it's there. But at the same time, the artist explains there's a gnawing feeling of guilt in the back of their mind. Even if I'm staring at the screen like a zombie, the stress of the real world is there. So the piece is meant to represent the illusion of escape, the feeling of being so completely drawn into a device that you can't escape. So the background is showing the screens, the windows, the tabs, and then the rectangular paint strokes in the foreground are inspired by glitches. And it's meant to show the atmosphere, the feeling of being in another world removed from reality. So Alex, what is your first reaction to this painting?
My first reaction is I'm really impressed with the use of colors. I think most of the time, especially for artists of this age, if they want the tone to be blue, they're like, okay, let's use only cool colors. But just the fact that they're using that nice red for the flesh tone, look at that contrast that's coming up and that diversity of the greens, blues, and purples in the background. Yeah, I'm impressed by the colors being so simple and yet so effective and not falling back on standard cliches.
For me, I think my favorite thing about this piece is that it's not a cliche. And when you're talking about screen usage and digital devices and all of those things, you can run into a lot of typical tropes. They're looking on the phone, they're watching TV, or they're being sucked into the TV or something like that. And this one doesn't fall into any of those categories. So I really like the glitch effect that you have. As Alex went into the color very well, and I won't repeat what he said, but I agree the color's really great. And yeah, I just think that it's really strong.
And I'll tell you, I don't oftentimes see people mixing watercolor and acrylic. I feel like I see watercolor and gouache a lot, but typically I usually see acrylic just by itself. And I have to say, I think that this artist is doing a brilliant job because it seems like what they're doing is the acrylic paint backs up what's happening with the watercolor. And Alex, I know that's something you've done in the past, where you have combined watercolor and acrylic. Do you find that this artist is taking advantage of the best of both worlds?
Absolutely. And before I go into how well I think they're doing, we do have the artist joining us today. So Moonbeam's joining us, and they're the artists behind this piece. So hello, I'm glad you could join us. And yeah, that is the thing that I'm most impressed by about this, because it's using the elements of watercolor and acrylic perfectly, which, think of it in this way, you're playing with transparency and pure opacity when you mix those two mediums. And they're so intelligently using that, the way that saving the acrylic for those last bitches of glitch over the face, like the ones over the hand and by the chin, is so smart, and the watercolor is the perfect way to express the figure and the background. So it's such a good harmony of those two mediums.
For sure. And I think that that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to consider, opacity and transparency. I find a lot of the times people are either all transparent or all opaque. And Moonbeam, the fact that you were so strategic about what's opaque versus what's transparent, really, really nice job. So Jordan, if we go back and we look at the full image, what about light and dark contrast? How do you think Moonbeam did with that?
So I think the colors are in the right area. As far as light and dark, I think it could be pushed just a little bit more, because there are areas where I don't feel a sense of a screen glowing, and the turquoise blue look is accurate, but I don't think there's enough darks to really support the bright light that's supposed to be coming from the screens. And I think that's a huge aspect when you're talking about a screen making contact with something on you, or your hair, or your clothing, or whatever the case may be. So Alex, do you have any thoughts on the lighting?
Yeah, I was just doing the fun trick that having glasses gives you, where if you take them off, you can see the blurred image to look at the contrast better. And yeah, like apart from the eyes, or the lack thereof, I should say, that's the darkest point. And there's not really a gradient between that darkest point and the next shade of gray. It's a very big jump. And so, yeah, just diversifying that range, I think would be really, really effective for that.
Well, speaking of the eyes, we have a comment from Maria Bell. Are the eyes being empty, symbolizing them being empty inside while on a device? Well, Moonbeam, before you tell us, Jordan, what do you think the empty eyes are meant to be? Because you sort of can't not see that. It's a pretty prominent part of the portrait.
For me, it reminded me a little bit of The Matrix, where you're looking at like a black screen, there's just some text written on there. That's how I saw it at first glance. But I don't know, it could also just be talking about how much looking at screens can destroy your eyes. So it could probably go between either of those.
Alex, what's your take on the eyes being literal? I guess I read them as being empty, like holes actually inside the face. How do you interpret that choice?
Yeah, it's funny. The first thing that comes to my mind is like images from like classic 70s and 80s horror movies, almost like the Michael Myers, The Shape in Halloween, that kind of look. It has that haunting look, but for me, the eyes doesn't really support or fit the artist statement. I'd be just curious to see this piece, or what the sketches looked like with the eyes there, because that expression added to the face could change or support the artist statement so much. And I just feel like the empty eyes kind of seems a little empty in a way.
I mean,
pardon the pun.
I feel like the empty eyes for me are a distraction, because I guess my first read is that they're not there to make the figure look a little bit more robotic. But then it falls into the cliche of, oh, I'm a person being consumed by technology and the technology is eating me alive. And I wonder if maybe not removing the eyes would actually make them less distracting, because I do read it almost like a mask, like you were saying in the Halloween movies. And I don't know that that really fits with the theme. Either way, you could try some other things. I mean, Moonbeam, maybe you can tell us in the chat if you did multiple thumbnail sketches, if there was a point where you kept the eyes in there. I'd be interested to hear that. Slepnir is asking, I wonder how gouache would work as compared to acrylic. I do like the opacity of acrylic. Well, Alex, you're the gouache expert. So can you explain to us, if Moonbeam, say, used gouache instead, what might be an advantage as opposed to acrylic?
I think that using gouache as opposed to acrylic. So when you're using acrylic on top of watercolor, the second you put it on, boom, that's an acrylic painting. And you cannot blend or mix those together. Whereas watercolor and gouache, those are technically and chemically the same thing, despite their difference in opacity. So you could make a watercolor painting, apply gouache, and then still work watercolor into it. It's not the end game. Whereas acrylic is plastic based, so that ain't coming off. So once you make that step, you're continuing on that journey. So I would be curious to see your journey of not just watercolor and acrylic, which is so extreme that you're doing it so well, adding in that third one in gouache right in the middle there might help with the value structure as well, like we were talking about a little earlier.
Jordan, how about the composition, the placement of the figure within this background?
It's split between for me, because I do like the composition as is, but part of me is questioning whether or not I like the head being so centered in the horizon, or horizontally speaking. So I think that maybe even pushing the figure more to the right and having more of the screen in front, or those screen textures in front, would imply that claustrophobia a little bit more, or that feeling of being overwhelmed by the screens. And I do like the aspect of the arm coming up as well. But again, it feels a little too straight up and down, where I feel like there could be a little bit more dynamism in it or somewhere.
Alex, do you have any thoughts on maybe ways to make the composition work better?
I was thinking of what Jordan's saying, and I think that with the screen effects and the glitch effects, making them push and pull backwards could be a really effective way to go. It sounds so weird to put it in such simple terms, but it's almost like I see them all on the same plane behind her and then the same plane in front of her. Whereas if they really were pushed back and forward more, I think that it had have a really cool look. Like specifically in the bottom right corner, imagine if those were right in the foreground rather than kind of blending into the figure in the midground. That alone would make so much of a sense of depth in space.
I mean, I actually wonder if it's less an issue of composition and more integration of figure into the background. Because actually, one of my favorite parts of this image is this lower right-hand corner with the stripes that are on the shirt. The way that area just really dissolves into the background, I think, is such a beautiful transition. That's one of my favorite parts of the painting. Whereas when I get to the top part of the face with the hair, it just feels like wallpaper in the background. And I feel like if maybe the figure was a little bit looser, that might maybe work a little bit better in terms of tricking us a little bit more in terms of the space. We have a question from Neil, who's saying, I find it really hard to darken watercolors without making it muddy. Any tips for that? Alex, you're much better at watercolor than me, and I'm thinking Jordan, so yeah. Sorry, Jordan.
Take it away.
There's no magic tube in watercolor except for Paynes gray, Paynes gray. It's fantastic. And I think the key thing to avoid muddiness is to maintain doing it in layers and be conscious of the colors you're using to make those layers. So if you're consistent, it avoids the muddiness, obviously. And also stray away from using black as a shadow, because that just sucks the color out of that. Using dark blues, and like I said, Paynes gray is a great neutral yet slightly cool gray, and it's got like a bluish hue to it. It's stellar for using for shading watercolor.
All right, let's talk anatomy, because we have the anatomy police here, right, Jordan? Actually, it's you and me. So, Jordan, how do you see the anatomy? Because there's a lot of the face, but the hands are very prominent in this composition. So is this a piece that needs more anatomy, maybe less? Because it really depends on the piece.
I don't think it needs more anatomy necessarily, because when I think of the concept about technology and our relationship with it, we pretty much just deal with it with our hands and our faces. And so I feel like almost having more of the body, like showing the whole figure, would kind of pull me out of what the piece was trying to say, if that makes sense.
Moonbeam is saying, yeah, I did a good deal of thumbnail sketches, but I agree with your point about the eyes. I think it was a lot less thoughtful about that decision than a lot of the rest of the piece. Well, let's go back to what Jordan was just saying about the possibility of having more of the figure showing, because I think one thing about the gesture of the figure that I think could be better, it's a pretty stiff gesture. Like, Alex, don't you imagine this person is standing pretty upright? Whereas if you think about somebody's posture, has a lot to do with their personality. Like if somebody's like bending over or if they're like really upright. And I don't know, I just sort of picture this person almost like collapsing from the technology. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's actually one where I think it's showing just enough to get that, where to make that pose, you have to have that like hunchback, kind of be almost cocoon-like. And I think showing more of that figure would be, for that purpose, a little unnecessary, but I'd be really curious about how that could be applied to a different sense of the artist statement. 'Cause, yeah, I think what's showing works.
Yeah, the only thing I'm just worried about is the reason why I say I don't want to show too much of the figure is because I've seen so many images dealing with this similar topic where the whole body's just hunched over and they're like practically, kissing the phone and they're like this. And I want Moonbeam to stay away from those types of images because I've seen them so many times it's become a cliche at this point.
Yeah, and I want to like piggyback off of you on like praising Moonbeam for avoiding the cliches of this subject matter, because just even in the artist statement, starting with all the benefits of phone use, and that's that thing where so much of art made about phone use and internet use is all negative. But it's like, yeah, you have to acknowledge like, no, it is really handy to kind of escape, and that tension between the peace it can bring, but also that frustration of becoming zombie-like from it is a very real thing. And I think that's providing a lot of the meat and potatoes to this piece.
Well, I think a lot of us have a love-hate relationship with our smartphones. I mean, there are some days when I'm like, I love my smartphone. It's the greatest thing that's ever been invented, especially if you grew up in the 80s when there was no texting and you had to pay $2 a minute to talk to your friend that lived in the next state. I just think it's amazing. But the other half of me resents it a lot. And so to me, this is a different take because it's not just technology bad. It's like I love and hate it at the same time. So there is that inner conflict that goes on. Let's talk about the representation of the technology because we have all the abstract shapes of the background. There's also this wiring that seems to go through the figure. Jordan, what do you think about those sections of the painting?
I actually think the wiring is very, very clever, and mostly because I feel like it makes sense integrated with the arm. It's not in the forehead or anything like that, but it's in places that veins look like they would go. And for that reason, I feel like that's a very clever take on this this image of the wiring.
Alex, what about you? What do you think about the wires?
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I love how it's tracing the veins, and it's perfect because I think it's showing just enough. Like, honestly, if I was doing this, I would be tempted to show too much of that. Be like, oh, let's have the veins going like everywhere, which would get more into like the body horror realm. But no, it's just enough where it doesn't come off as too creepy or too terrifying. It's just a nice, perfect little nod. So the subtlety in that is, I really appreciate it.
Blighted Angel is saying, I quite like the posture of the figure. It looks like the torso is tipping forward just a little bit with the head in the process of falling back to stare upwards. Actually, I was going to say, one of my favorite parts of this painting is the lower section of the arms. I think that area has very little detail, but in some ways has more form than maybe areas like the nose and the mouth that are a lot more detailed. Like from a saturation versus muted color point of view, let me just go back to that slide where we can see it up close. I mean, this is beautiful. Like you see how bright and saturated the violet is on the right, and then these like really cool, like frosty seafoam green colors in the arm. Like you would not typically think about a pale green in that type of area. And so Moonbeam, I'm very impressed by your ability, I think, to balance the saturated colors with the warm colors. I think that's very, very impressive. So another thing I would recommend, though, just to give yourself more ideas, is to watch the stream on how figure paintings are composed. Because we talk all the time about composition, but like Jordan, it's a little different when you have people in the composition, don't you think? So what do you think is really important to think about when you're composing with a figure?
Well, figures can do so many things that a lot of other things can't. Trees, they can make unique shapes, but oftentimes humans can just be way more dynamic. You can show emotion, you can show a lot of story in there, and depending on the angle and the situation, you can have an infinite number of possibilities. And so you always want to make sure you get that right when you pick the composition for your piece.
And then we also have a couple of these images from the contemporary artist Lucas Samaras, who was very popular in the 1980s. And I was just thinking, Moonbeam, these would be really good for you to look at, because it's another situation where the light is a weird color, like it's a magenta light that's hitting the figure. And that could be something you think about doing. Like, you can go out and buy a red light bulb and put it on your face and do these weird, eerie situations that I think might be a lot of fun for you to do. Alex, have you ever played with light like that?
It's so funny as you're saying all that and bringing up Lucas Samaras, who honestly I've not seen before. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. Like, I love the colors he's using with this, and they're so simple. Like, you can tell they're not the best camera in the world, and it's just by using different colored lights. And it's honestly the kind of thing that I'd be very curious to try and play around with. Not in the sense of recreating photographs of it, but using colored lighting to inspire life drawing.
And then Moonbeam, I would also say, although you have a pretty good sense of light and shadow, you can do more. I think that the image can be more luminous. I think you can be more specific about the type of shadow you're using, because there's cast shadows, there's form shadows. So I really recommend you watch this stream, because once you can start to break that down a little bit more specifically, it's going to help you a lot. But I will say, you guys, Alex, what were you doing when you were 15? I was not doing this. I can tell you that.
Yeah, nope. It was a really unique idea. I don't think anyone had ever done it before. It was a comic about vampire hunters. I know, like, so original. It was so unique, and it was awful. Yeah, I was not doing anywhere close to this.
And Jordan, what were you drawing when you were 15?
Fan art. Lots of fan art.
There's nothing wrong with fan art. I mean, fan art has its place. We're just trying to make a point, Moonbeam, that this is sort of amazing that you're 15 and you're making stuff like this. I mean, this is really a sophisticated composition. You have a really good grasp on different subtle shifts of color. I mean, we didn't even talk about the warm and cool contrast between the skin and the background. So we're just sort of blown away right now by all this. Even though we're telling you all these things that we think could be better, we're just really excited about seeing this, because the effort is really there. You can really see you're thinking about it, you're making the effort, and that's very inspiring. So good work, Moonbeam. Okay, we're going to lead in now to a Q&A. So we'll do this for, I don't know, like 20, 15 minutes or so. So now is your time to pick our brain. We've got Jordan here, we've got Alex here, and you guys can ask us whatever you want, because well, not whatever. You can ask us almost anything you want. I've learned this. You have to be very careful when you're a teacher.
They can ask whatever they want, and we can choose not to answer whatever we want.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Like, nope, next.
Way to take control, Alex. You'll be a great classroom teacher someday. So yeah. Anyway, let's see. Oh, people are sharing what they were doing when they were 15. Neil wanted to be a priest to design your own rose windows. Well, why don't you design the whole Gothic cathedral while you're at it?
That is so unique. I've never heard that before. That's cool.
Blue Wolf Spirit says, I was drawing Pete the Pirate from the Mad Magazine art school ad. Not sending it in, but drawing it. And Alyssa didn't even want to do thumbnails. You know what, Alyssa? Dang. I have art school students at RISD who don't want to do thumbnails. So this is not isolated to people who are 15 years old. Okay, we have a question from Yellow Heart Studio. When will Art Prof have more watercolor videos and demos? I am still working on editing the rest of my Utah watercolor tutorial. I'm really hoping to get that out pretty soon. Now that I'm not teaching in the classroom, I actually have more time. But we might start doing some live streams. It's just we're still figuring out some of the tech stuff right now in terms of delivering that. But yes, absolutely on our list. This is a question for Alex. Do you have a gouache recommendation in terms of brand?
Yes, Winsor Newton, hands down, period. Love them. I've never seen a reason to deviate from them. You can get a good, decent palette in just their Series 1 pretty easily, and then just saving their more expensive tubes for when you really get a hang of it.
Lisa H. wants to know from Alex, how is the new coffee shop going?
It is hopefully we'll be able to serve up coffee at the end of October. So, yeah, so close.
All right, and we have a question from Christina. Will you have more content for grad school portfolios? We will. If you guys take a look at our October live stream schedule, you'll see that we do have a stream that is talking about how to prepare a portfolio for an MFA program. And actually, we're bringing in Layla Faye, who is currently in the MFA Yale program, who actually was in the same freshman section as Jordan back in like the olden days. So such a tiny community. I mean, this is why I tell students, I'm like, guys, never, ever burn those bridges. Seven Angelic says, any Procreate demos in the future? Jordan, I think you can answer that.
Yes, we are planning them as we speak, and they're going to be great. And it's going to feature more than just me and Clara. So, yeah, it's going to be fun.
We're not going to tell you who. You have to guess who's going to be the next staff member. AJ says, I used to use watercolor all the time, but this past year it's been gouache. Now, since I've been using gouache for a while, I find it hard to go back to watercolor. Any tips?
That's such a good question, because I had the same thing where I kind of blinked, and for years I was doing watercolor and gouache together. And then eventually I noticed I was just doing gouache. And the tip would be, it took me doing just watercolor again. Like I've been doing little 5x5 practice paintings, little portraits almost, in just watercolor, no gouache, to kind of connect myself with that benefit. Because I do firmly believe that the benefit of those mediums is when you use them together. I do think inherently you're doing a disservice to yourself if you're just using one or the other. You could potentially use both. So I'm going to try to stick with that philosophy.
Blighted Angel says, I have a lot of trouble creating multiple thumbnails. Any tips to get the ball rolling? Jordan, why don't you answer that?
So usually when people have trouble creating thumbnails, it could be one of two reasons. One is they're not thinking of the story, and two, they're not thinking in terms of shape. And oftentimes whenever I have an issue, I revert back to those two. Thinking of shape is really important for thinking of the basic building blocks. You don't have to go all intricate in the minor details of what belt this character is wearing or anything like that. And it'll also help you to see the composition from far away. And story, I feel like is pretty self-explanatory. We talked about that in the stream even, but always have a story when connected with a piece of work.
Alex, any tips for thumbnails?
I think it's funny because I do have a struggle with thumbnails as well. Like it's like eating vegetables. It's so hard to do, but you just got to do it.
It's hard to eat carrots.
Yeah, they're all crunchy and tough. No, I think Jordan phrased it really well in like a way that's very approachable. Because to me, it's kind of like once you get a couple done, then it moves slower. The hard part is just getting past those first 1 through 5. And really just being okay with letting go of ideas. Like I'm tempted to get my first thumbnail and be like, well, that's good enough. I guess I'm done. No, you have to kind of push it away. You might go back to it, but you let yourself explore.
Kiva is saying, do you know of any cheaper gouache brands? I'm going to assume compared to Winsor & Newton, which, yes, I do think with a lot of paints, you get what you pay for. That's not always the case with art supplies. Sometimes it's like, yeah, this thing is really not necessary. But I find with gouache, you do get what you pay for. Although I don't know, Alex, maybe you've experienced something different. What do you think?
Yeah, so like I can't even remember the cheap brand that I got when I first used gouache and didn't like it.
Was it Reeves?
Might have been Reeves. Like I
They're
can't
really
confirm them. I genuinely don't remember it. I might have begun with a G, but anyway. I think that if price is the issue for you, really not just the quality in the pigment, but the quality in the medium itself is so good with Winsor and Newton that anything else is an inaccurate representation. So I think that if price is the obstacle, then I would recommend getting just like two colors, one warmer and one cooler, one lighter shade, one darker shade, and just working with those, or even a single color and white, and play around with gouache using that. That way, for under $20, you can have enough to play with to see if you get a hang of the medium.
And gouache lasts a while, Alex,
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
it? I mean, it goes on so thin. It's not like you're squirting out big chunks. And so it is sort of painful to pay that much for this little
Yeah.
tiny tube, but it doesn't go away quickly, right?
It really doesn't. And the tubes that I use the most are the lower end, like ones like Van Dyke Brown, Pines Gray. Those are both Series 1. They're maybe $8 a tube, and a single tube can last me months if I'm going through it quickly. But then I have tubes that I've honestly had since college, which was going on 10 years ago now. And those are like the color, like cadmium yellow, which I don't use a lot of. I still have that tube. Still good to go.
Alyssa is saying, I want to know about Professor Liu's reputation at RISD. Why are students afraid of taking her classes? I think Jordan and Alex can explain this better than me. So Jordan, why don't you go first?
So some of you may or may not know that before I went to RISD, I watched as many YouTube videos on RISD that I could find, and Clara's old videos popped up, and she was very, very intense. And when I walked into class, that same persona that I saw on the camera being very intense was brought into the classroom, and I was terrified. And I was just like, oh my goodness. It was just an intimidating experience for me. And now 7 years later, we're laughing on YouTube.
You were 18. You were a little
I was
younger
18.
than you are now.
It was wild. Yeah.
Alex, why is everybody afraid of my class?
It's fun. Yeah, because I enrolled in your class not knowing anything about you. And then when like just me and my friends were talking about what classes we got into this semester, I was like, oh yeah, and I got this class with, I think it's Professor Liu. And they're like, oh, I've heard she's so tough. I heard she's so hard. But honestly, the thing that was such a relief, not just, we had a really unique class size where it was a very small section, and it was really, I think, powerful for all of our growth in that room. But also, like, you just didn't have any sense of ego about your tough teacherness, if that makes sense. Like, shameless compliment time, you weren't doing it for your own, like, gravitas. You were just like, no, this could be better, period. Like, it was just very refreshing.
Life's too short to beat around the bush. What, I'm going to sit around and pat you on the back for an hour? No way. Let's get to work. And this is an interesting comment from Emma, who says, I thought people really wanted to get into her classes. This is true. Lauren Welch, one of the teaching artists here, really fought to get into my class. So here's the question, Jordan, because there are teachers like this in college who have a reputation, and yet people want to be in their classes. Why do you think that is? Why would you want to be in a class like that?
Well, usually when the teachers have a reputation, it's either really, really good, like as in that you work hard, but the work you come out with is so amazing, or they just are terrible all the way around. And I think when you have that sort of dichotomy, you're always interested in the ones who are really good. And I've never heard anyone complain about, someone having an experience in Clara's class where their work didn't improve, or that she didn't give good feedback or anything like that. So you're tough, but you also work as hard as possible to get everyone to the level that they need to be at by the end of the semester.
All right, George is asking, do you have any experience with acrylic gouache? What do you think about it? I found that I really like the matte acrylic look of it. Okay, stupid question. What is acrylic gouache? Like, I'm so confused, Alex. Can you please explain this?
Acrylic gouache, and it's very important because it is extremely different from gouache. Acrylic gouache essentially is it's been so long, I can't quite remember if it's as plastic based as acrylic is, but it dries exactly right. It dries very matte, very opaque, very clean. I hate using it. I don't like it one bit. I tried it and it just doesn't work for me. But I'm going to look up this artist that I love who does portraits with acrylic gouache, and they're phenomenal. So I'm going to try to remember their name and share it with y'all. But yeah, it's one of those, I tried it, not for me.
Bastin is saying, I want to know, is it better to limit my color palette than try to use a variety of colors when I'm still learning and painting? Well, Jordan, you've done painting digitally and traditionally. What helped you? Was it better to have a limited palette, or did you just want access to everything?
I think having a limited palette is always better, because when you have a limited palette, there's only so many places your color can go, and it's easier for them to kind of sync together. Whereas when you are on, especially when you're working digitally, you suddenly have access to like 16 million different colors. And there's no way every single pixel or every single color is going to be able to fit well into any one painting. So most of the time when I'm working, I'll pick like 5 or 6 colors. Half of them are maybe even blues, some are reds and browns and stuff, and I'll just use that. And if I need a highlight or something very specific that stands out, then I'll take the time to really apply that color. But I always stick with limited palettes.
I mean, one of the reasons I don't paint with a lot of colors is because I think when you paint with just a few colors, you really have to mix your colors. Like if you have 5 yellows and 15 blues and 13 oranges, you get really lazy about the mixing because you're like, oh, the orange is right there. But if every time you need to use orange, you have to mix it. Yeah, it's more work, but that's how I really learned to mix colors, because that's what I found whenever I taught beginning painting classes. People really don't want to mix their colors because they feel like it's a lot of work. I don't know, Alex, what about you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was looking up the artist that I said I was going to look up, and I did find his name. It's Rich Pellegrino. But could you repeat the question? Oh, it was about mixing colors rather than using a variety of colors. I think that it's easy to learn how the paint works by sticking with just one. But you won't really get to have fun and enjoy it as much as using multiple colors. But if budget is an issue, then yeah, stick with just one until you get a feel for it, and then slowly get yourself some more colors.
Lisa H. wants to know why the big love for the Apple Pencil. Jordan, this is for you.
So the Apple Pencil is specifically designed to work with the iPad. And so, I mean, there are other third-party styluses that can be used, but I've heard not so good things about them compared to the Apple Pencil. And it has a great level of sensitivity. There's little parallax, and for those who don't know what it means, that's basically how much space there is between the pen and the screen itself. Sometimes there's a little too much distance where it's hard to know where you're actually drawing or painting, whereas the iPad's very minimal. And there's also the added bonus of being able to tilt the pencil, here it's right here, tilt it on its side and kind of shade like this, and it'll act just like a piece of, like a charcoal stick, or a piece of whatever instrument you're using to draw on its side. So lots of benefits there. It's expensive though.
Morgan is asking, does anyone know where I could get my artwork critiqued now in our current situations? Art conventions are closed in my area. Well, we do have many different places on Art Prof where you can have your work critiqued. So let me show you the first one. Like if you want to be featured in a video the way we did with Moonbeam today, if you go to artprof.org and you click on critiques, there's a green button. If you click on it, it takes you to this form, and you can submit your artwork to be considered for a YouTube feature. The other thing, though, that's really great, though, is we have so many critique channels in the Art Prof Discord. And that's even better because you're getting opinions from all different types of people. And so, Jordan, why would you say that's helpful to hear from many voices as opposed to, say, just 2 people?
It kind of goes into what me and Lauren discussed last night about hearing from your family and friends. When you get a range of opinions from people who are close to you or very few people, there's a limited scope of analyzation that goes on with a piece. So when you suddenly allow others to chime in and share their opinions and have their life experience, and they look at it, there's a lot of things that will pop up that you probably did not consider. And I think that that's always a really good way to go, especially as a beginning artist and as you're learning to sharpen your eye and your instinct for the art that you're making.
Johnny is saying, never understood the purpose of allowing watery paint to drip down the surface of artwork, especially in portraits. Is this a Jackson Pollock influence? What do you think, Alex?
That's funny. I've never thought of it in the way of like Pollock specifically inspired, but I suppose depending on the time, yeah, it very well could be. I think I like the look that it sometimes does in creating that contrast between a highly rendered face and then a very abstract environment, background, or other parts of the figure or body. I think that that's I personally find it a very cool look for portrait painting and a way to spice it up, more so for the artist, so not everything has to be so dull and dreary, that you can kind of get some flair into it while still capturing the likeness of the figure.
Anna Jolie is saying, Jordan, I'm very curious to see what accessories you use for drawing on the iPad, like stands, screen protectors, etc.
Okay, so I don't think, oh, I do have it. So I have this for screen protector. I don't know if you guys can see it. It's called Tech Armor. I think it comes with 2 in here, and this is like $12 on Amazon, and it gives just a little bit of a texture on the screen that I really appreciate. I have this case for my iPad that allows me to open up like this. Where's the camera? There. And so it is able to make a stand in this direction, or I could have it lift up like this, depending on how I'm drawing. And then I also have a little pencil holder that I stuck onto the front, so I always have the Apple Pencil with me. So that's all I got for accessories for this thing.
All right, guys, Art Prof has a podcast. It's available on Spotify and also on iTunes. And please hang out with us in the Discord. We will be, Alex, me, and Jordan, hanging out in the post live streams channel, because I saw there's a whole other bunch of questions in here that we just didn't have time to get to. So if you guys want to come over there, we're happy to answer your questions. If you are not in the Discord, the invite link is in the video description below. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and join the Art Prof family. And thank you so much to our top Patreon supporters. Thank you to everybody in the chat for giving their comments. To Moonbeam, thank you so much for sharing your artwork with us. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.